when Dawn was just 2 years old, her father abandoned the family. Her mother was left to raise 4 daughters by herself. They were an unchurched family, but her mother taught them all to do the right thing, to be honest, to be kind. Now, with 4 girls in the house, there was an awful lot of dancing, and that is what Dawn decided was her calling in life, to become a dancer. And so she studied dance, she practiced dance. When she went to college, she majored in dance, and after a few years of college, she dropped out, married one of her fellow dancers, and they began to pursue a professional career in dancing. Now, because they were so talented, they had many ways that they could have gone about doing that, but what they decided to do was to open up a dance school in Peoria, Illinois. One of Dawn's friends invited her to a little church. It was very foreign to Dawn, and in some ways maybe even odd, but it felt as if the words that were spoken there seemed to be directed at her personally. After a while, another friend invited her to another church, this time to an Easter service. And there was a part of the service that was actually a celebration through dance. Oh, Dawn loved the whole thing, not just the dancing, but again, the lyrics of the song, the words that were spoken, the scriptures that were read seemed to speak to her directly. And she continued to visit this church, and it was in this church that Dawn decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ. They didn't attend that church for very long, however, because she and her husband were offered a gig to perform in a show in Branson, Missouri. And so they packed up their things, they headed to Branson, they began to be performers on the stage. But there, Dawn continued to pursue her relationship with God. She spent time in prayer. She spent time reading God's word. She wanted to learn about him and to grow with him. Now, her husband had exactly the opposite reaction. He mocked Dawn when he saw her reading the scripture. He would even curse at her if he saw that she was praying. And one time, when they came back to Peoria to attend a friend's wedding, Dawn's husband told her that he wanted a divorce. He got in his car and he drove away without him. Once again, Dawn was abandoned. Dawn went to live with her mother. Okay, I'm getting feedback. Dawn went to live with her mother and her stepfather in Missouri, and this was a difficult time. A lot of pain, a lot of heartache, but it was also a time where Dawn learned that she needed to rely on God even more in these difficult times, that he would be the source of her help. He would be the source of her healing. While she was there, Dawn had a friend who lived on the East Coast who invited her to visit. And so Dawn headed out to the East Coast. And when she got there, her friend said, "Oh, I hate to tell you this, but since I invited you, I was actually given an assignment at work that is going to take me out of town for this week. But you can stay here by yourself in my house on the shore." And so while she was there, Dawn's practice was that every morning she would go out and walk out on the shore. And then she would go out onto the rocks that jutted out into the waters. Because there was no one else around, she would just cry out to the Lord and weep as loud as she wanted to. Before she went out on that last morning of her unscheduled retreat, even before she left the house, she said, "Lord, I need to hear from you. I need to know what to do. I need to know where to go." And then she headed out for her morning walk. But on this morning, something different happened. She actually saw a person and a dog coming toward her. The dog ran ahead and came up to Dawn first. And by the time that the owner of the dog got there, Dawn recognized her as an elderly woman. And she apologized about the dog and the jumping and all that. And Dawn said, "Don't worry, I'm not afraid of the dog. That's okay." And they crossed paths and went on their way. Dawn went out onto the rocks as she did every day, wept, prayed, and called out to the Lord. When she was heading back to the house, the two of them crossed paths again. Again, the dog had run ahead, and Don had bent down and was scratching behind the dog's ears and welcoming the dog. And it was as if in a moment, that woman was there again. And that woman looked Don directly in the eyes and said, "You need to go home. You are his favorite. God loves you. He has a plan for you. You need to go home and trust him." Once again, these words spoke directly to Don. And as they continued to speak to one another, Don found out that this woman was actually a nun who was also a guest at one of the shore houses. And that morning, God had spoken to the nun and told the nun that he had a message for her to deliver to someone on the beach this morning. And she had thought this was strange because she had never run into anybody else on the shore either. But this was an appointment that was scheduled by God. Dawn went back to Missouri and reported for work the next day. And when she got to work, her boss called her into the office and he said, "You know, I'm starting a new store in Central Illinois. I was wondering if you would be willing to go there and to oversee the opening of this new store and to be the manager there." And it was then that Dawn realized that to go home did not mean to go live with her mother and her stepfather, but it was to go home to that church where she had met the Lord and where she had given her life to him. And this is where Dawn still is today. Years later, Dawn is still there at my church. Not only that, she is a leader in our church. And so you know that there is a lot more to her story that I could tell you at another time. So this is a story of one of my friends, Dawn. And this is a story that comes from my church. And I share it with you as a personal story of faith from someone in my church. I want to tell you just before we kind of get into the meat of this that at the end, Roger's going to send you a handout. So if you want to take notes of some kind, you could, but you're going to get a handout that has a lot of information, some of the lists, some of the sources and things like that. He'll send it to you, so you'll have it there. So history of your church. When we think about the history of the church, we might think in the big picture historical, we might think of the Reformation, or we might think of the Awakening, revivals, we might think of missionary movements, things like that. You might think of something like this. Some of you may have seen a book like this. This is a book about the church that I grew up in. And this is the 50th anniversary. Now we've actually passed many more years. But if you have ever seen a book like this, you might see some things like I see when I open this, that I see like a picture of a big empty sanctuary. I see a picture of the outside of the building. I see a picture that has a whole bunch of people, but they're really small and there are no names. And maybe there's a picture of somebody with a shovel breaking ground before you start the new addition on the building. And those are all important to keep a record of and to see how God has worked in your church in kind of the big picture. But it's also important to think about what are the personal stories where God is working in the lives of the people. And so I would like to ask you some questions throughout our session today, and they're mostly going to be yes or no questions, so you can just be answering with a yes, thumbs up, or a no, thumbs down. And if you really feel, I can't really go yes or no, if you want to do one of these, you can. But I think most of them you'll be able to go yes or no. So I have a couple questions at this time. So here's my first question. How many of you have either witnessed or heard about God working in the life of someone in your church? You've either seen it yourself or you've heard them tell about it. Okay, good. Most of us have. Good. How many of you have ever told someone else's story? Like as I just told you Dawn's story. How many of you have ever done that, where you've actually told the story of someone, God working in someone else's life? Okay, good, good. So those are important to pass on, those personal stories. And I have an example here from my pastor. And it's not that I want you to get this book. I am just showing you one way that someone else did this, collecting the stories, the personal stories of faith of those in your church. So I think you can read the big words, God can, and this will be on the handout. But there's more to the title. There's kind of a long version of the title. When all of life seems to shout, you can't, God can. And this is Dawn's story, is chapter 1 in this book. And there's other people in the story where our pastor has interviewed them, listened to them, of course, gotten their permission and so on to share their story. And he happened to tie them into some Bible stories as well. And that is available for people to know that these are real people that you could meet. You could walk up to them. You could call them on the phone and talk to them and ask them about their stories. And there are stories that you could pass on and tell other people their stories as well. As I said, my pastor loves to tell stories. And I would say he's a natural storyteller. And sometimes he tells the same story over and over, if you know what I mean. And so I've been going to my church for a long time. And he'll start telling stories. I'm like, don't you remember you already told it? I think this to myself. Don't you remember you already told that story? I mean, just a while ago, he started telling this story in his message. And I thought, oh, you have told this story so many times. I could tell this story. Oh, light bulb, right? Light bulb. That is exactly the point. He has told that story so many times that I could tell you the story about the man who vowed he would never, ever sell his land to a church of any kind, and he sold the land to our church. I could tell you that story. And so I began to realize that telling them again and again is part of the process, that we can learn them and hear them again and tell them again and tell different people. So that's just kind of my whole philosophy of sharing the stories and how important that is to not just save the big picture history of your church, but what is God doing in the lives of the people. So what kind of stories should we be gathering, hearing, telling, saving, and so on? One is your church history, as I showed you that book. That is important. But you also want to share the faith stories of those in your church. And then you also want to share your family history. Just more than a genealogy. Genealogies are trending, at least in the United States, where you either research the records or you turn in your DNA or whatever it is you do to find out your genealogy. But what are the actual stories of your family? So I have some questions for you. So again, these are yes or no questions. So let's see. How many of you could name first and last name all 4 of your grandparents? Okay, good. So now, how many of you could tell a story, not just where they came from or what their job was or where they lived, but you could tell a story about one of your grandparents, something that happened to him or her? How many could tell a story about one of your grandparents? Okay, we got some people saying yes, some people thinking still. Okay, good. So that's just something to think about, that your family history isn't just a family tree or a genealogy, but it's stories about, was he funny? Could she sing? Did she sing songs? Did she, is there a time when he got in trouble? Is there a time when he invented something, or was a leader in the church, or whatever the story might be. And then also another thing to be gathering and sharing are personal stories from your family. And I kind of listed that separately because that does not have to be going up the family tree. Telling stories about your generation, telling stories about the next generation, telling your children stories about when they were children. In my class, there's one day when I asked, we study the miracle worker about Helen Keller, and I asked my students to try to ask when they get home if they can find out from their parents what was the very first word you said. What was the very, and the kids don't know it. So they go ask, tell me a story about me. I can tell you a story about you. And sometimes you remember things that other person said, I didn't even remember I did that, but you remember the stories about them. Maybe telling stories about traditions that your family has or unique experiences. I already told Shashi a story about my brother who, when he's in India, watches the Minnesota Vikings play football in the middle of the night through an iPad camera. So that's a unique thing. Most people don't get up in the middle of the night to watch a football game. So that, tell those kinds of stories. And then also telling those stories of faith. Tell the stories of faith in your family. So here's another question, yes or no, to think about this. Could anybody in your family tell your testimony? Is there anybody in your family that has heard your testimony enough that they could actually tell your testimony? Anybody? I'm gonna go this. Yeah. Got some yeses, some no's, some not sure's. Yeah. I mean, a year ago, I would have definitely said no. But I've done some things that maybe there's someone who could. I don't know at this point. I hope there will be someone in the next coming years. So be thinking about that. So how do we save these stories? One thing is to record them, either interviews or stories or tours. I'll talk about what I mean by tours in a minute. So many times students are asked to interview someone in their family or someone from a different generation. They should record that, right? Record that. So you have that recording. Be thinking about audio recording, video recording. And the thing that's good about that, there's some pros and cons. The thing that's good about getting those recordings done is that you have the visual. If you're doing a video recording, you have the visual, that visual of them, not only what their voice sounds like, but their face and how they said it, their manner. We have a recording of my father, of him reading his favorite poem, and it's just like, I'm so glad we have that visual recording of him, and you can just see the which words, which phrases in the poem are most meaningful to him as he reads this poem, and so on. And then also, you're going to have probably more precision in the stories because they're coming straight from the person who experienced it. So having those video recordings are good. So I said story, get them to tell stories, get them to do interviews, and then tours. This is something I just heard from, I'd never thought of this, but somebody told me she did this with her mother when she went around her mother's house with her with a camera, and her mother told stories about this teapot or this painting, or this is a table that your brother made in shop class. And it doesn't maybe necessarily feel like quite a story, but getting that record, and being able to know more about maybe some of these objects prompt a memory, prompt a story, and more about those things. So that was something new to me, to video a tour, and it could be a tour of your church. It doesn't have to be a house. It could be a tour of a place you love to go on vacation or something, but kind of just a recording of that. So another question for you: how many of you have some kind of audio or video recording of family stories or any of those types of things? How many of you have some of those recordings? I already told you I have some. Okay. Yeah. So don't be discouraged. It's not too late to start. Now, the limitation with them is that as much as technology is right at our fingertips, as we're experiencing today, there are those who predict that this time will be the least documented time in history so far. And the reason they say that is things like people having these kind of pictures or recordings on their phones or on their cameras, and they never save them or back them up, and then the phone breaks, they lose the phone, whatever, they never have any backup, or they have so many that it's like I don't even know where to begin. I have so many pictures, and they're not labeled or organized well, and so it's really just kind of a fruitless cause to even try to track anything down. So there are kind of some cautionary things about that. If you're going to do that, have a great system of having it preserved, and multiple copies, things like that, with multiple people, so that if one person loses it, someone else has it, whatever. Another thing to do is to write them down. And certainly that can be done in conjunction with having the recording, but also write them down. And that way you're not dependent on technology. I know John Walsh, who is kind of, I don't know what we would call him, the founder of Bible telling, I guess we call him. Jan, his wife, is here. So he wrote a book with his personal stories. And I know he started it as a recording and then transcribed it into and tweaked it as a book, and it's called I Am Not a Duck, which I think comes from it's from one of the stories. I imagine it's the first story in the book. I don't remember right now. But I'm Not a Duck. So he took those recordings and made it into a book and had that written record. And then the third thing I would say, how do we preserve them, is to tell them often. Tell them again and again. Because you can preserve them in your memory and in your traditions as well. I know in my story, or in my family, there are certain stories that people will literally ask, tell the story about this. My grandmother used to come down and sit at our table every night for supper. And she lived in a different house on the same property, but she came every day for supper. And after supper, she would tell a story, and she would tell the same stories over and over and over. And now I can tell some of the stories because I heard them so many times. Ask to hear them. Ask someone to tell them again. So I find times to tell stories. When we go to our cabin's very remote, so we don't have TV or internet or anything like that. So after supper, I say, can I tell you a story? Sometimes I even make it seem like they're doing me a favor. Like, I've been working on a story. Can I practice for you? How can they say no to that? Telling them a story at Christmas time and other holidays when we get together. I have a big family, and so different people host different holidays. I I'll say to them, you know, could I tell a story after dinner or something like that? Or is there a time when I could just have 5 minutes to tell a story? And they always do that. And then some of you might know Ann Alexander. Um, she's on the Bible telling staff, but her mother actually created a game called the Appreciation Game. And that is a way, it kind of gives prompts for you to, it's a board game with where there's different categories and rolling the dice and you go around the board and it prompts you to share things about yourself or about others. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects that I have done. And I want you to remember that my projects are books, but they don't have, your project doesn't have to be a book. So take some of the principles that I'm talking about that I used in my book, but realize it doesn't have to be a book. It could be just a sharing time. It could be a recording, an audio or a video recording. It could be a story circle. There's a lot of ways that you could do it. So I have worked for the last, I guess it's 6 years, because I worked 2 years on each one. I call it a cookbook in quotes because it's really not just a recipe book. It's about 1/3 story. Well, let me go this order. It's 1/3 recipes. It's 1/3 pictures around mealtime things, food things, picnic things, like that. And then 1/3 is stories about family traditions, things that happened at the meal time, traditions for holidays, anything like that. So it really is a story book more than it is a recipe book. There are some recipes, and the recipes are from my mother and my 2 grandmothers. So if you can just scroll down to the next page. So that was the cover. I always put, this is me and my mom, and I put a little memory right in the introduction and kind of tell them why I did the book and so on. And yeah, like I said, I don't expect you to even read it, but just kind of to see what I did. And if you go on to the next page, Roger, thanks. Yeah, so here Emma is one of my grandmas. There's her picture holding me as a baby, aren't I precious? And one of her recipes. And go ahead down. This is my other grandma. And this is a recipe in her handwriting. So I actually got the actual recipe in her handwriting. It's a mess because it's been used a lot. But again, that's just another thing that made it more personal. Go ahead, down the page, Roger. And this one, again, I don't want to, I don't expect you to read the story. But what happened when I started doing this book is that I sent out emails to all my siblings about, do you have any memories about things that mom always made for dinner or things at grandma's house or anything like that? And I have 7 siblings. I got 1 reply. And the 1 reply was, I don't remember anything. And I'm like, okay. So I ended up going out and meeting with everybody one-on-one. I made a point of visiting with people over the summer. I'm a teacher, so I have the summer to kind of travel and visit people. And every single person, when I started talking to them, the memories came. And this is a story that my brother Michael, who's he's not this sentimental, he's not, he's kind of a matter-of-fact kind of guy. And he told me this story about sitting out in the grass eating lunch with my grandpa out of a lunchbox. I'm like, wow, I never would have known that story, And so here's an example of how the story got into the cookbook, so to speak. Go ahead, Roger. Let's see. I don't even remember what I have next here. Okay, here's another time. This is another thing about my grandma there, who I told you came for supper every night. I think this is probably a holiday because we're kind of fancied up there, but go ahead. Down. And then I included some things like this because we're Swedish, and so krumkaka, it's like they don't even know what this is, you know. So if I wrote about Primkaga, so I went online and found pictures of Primkaga and a Primkaga iron and things like that, because the kids don't even know what that is. Okay, I think that's it for now, Roger, for that, but we'll come back to the next page. Okay, so we're going to give you a chance to have a little breakout time. So Roger's going to put you, am I catching you off guard, or are you ready, Roger? You're good? Okay, thank you. So Roger's going to put you in a breakout room with 1 or 2 other people. And I think maybe we'll need 3 or 4 minutes. 4 minutes? I think we can do 4 minutes. I'd like you to share something from your family about mealtime, whether it's a traditional recipe, a holiday. This is what we always had at a certain holiday, or something funny that happened at the table, or something that happened many times at the table, but some kind of traditional or a memory from your family about mealtime or recipes or things like that. Okay? So that was my first project. And my second project was this book. It's about our family cabin. We have a cabin up in Canada, and it's been in my family for several generations. I'm kind of the middle generation. It's been 5 generations, and I'm generation 3, and I have nieces and nephews, and now they have kids. So Roger's gonna go ahead and pull that up, and I'll just point out some things that are a little different about this one. This had kind of records of things like when we built the docks and when we got certain boats, and you know, so it had some factual records, but it has a lot of stories, memories. Our island is called Bear Island, and so anytime there was a bear story, I marked that, especially about when people encountered bears. So those are stories people want to read about. I don't know if you noticed, but I'll just tell you, that's a little bit different font. I started getting other people involved in writing things. So this is one of my nieces who was involved. There was a big storm there were trees down everywhere on top of the cabin, things like that. And so my niece actually wrote something about that experience. No, that was something that I did that was a little different, where I started asking other people to really be contributing things like that. So here's a big event when the water level in the lake was so high. I don't know if you can see, there's that blue arrow pointing to the tops of the chairs. Those chairs are screwed down to the dock. So that's how my brother in the yellow coat is standing on the dock. So that's how high the water was above the dock. And this is a little something else that I did that was different here, is I sent out a survey. You know, like I asked about where you like to go fishing, what lures you like, while you like to eat your fish, which bunk is your favorite bunk, all those kinds of things. And then they kind of felt like, oh, I was kind of part of this book. And so that was something that I did that kind of took it to another level here, where they really felt like they were contributing and they wanted to see what they said, and if, you know, were they in the majority or the minority, things like that. Yeah, and then here's, on this one, I also just put other things, like these are other things that our family actually, like this is what I was talking about earlier, where we do have some recordings, some CDs and DVDs of other things related to the cabin, where they would have kind of directing them to other places where they could find stories about that. So that was just my second project. Now, I wish I could brag about being very, very wise and doing this third project third on purpose. And but I didn't. It was a coincidence, but it turned out to be a good choice, at least for my family. In my family, I was raised in a Christian home, but some people from my generation and some people from the next generation down below me have really walked away from their faith, have chosen different faith, or have chosen to have no faith. And so the third book project I had was about actually recording the faith stories. And I'm glad I didn't do that first in my family. Maybe in your family you could. But in my family, I think some people would have really felt as if that was kind of uh, preachy, maybe would be a way to say it, or I'm trying to convert them all or something like that, which I pray for that. But, I almost didn't do this book. But there were two things that happened that really compelled me to go ahead with this project. One is I grew up in one home. My whole childhood, as a matter of fact, we just sold it a few years ago. And um, the people who bought it were doing a lot of remodeling, and so they invited us in to come and look at what they were doing. Like, sure, you can come in and see how we're changing things and remember what it was like when you lived here. And I went up to my bedroom, which was the smallest bedroom upstairs, and they were actually changing it into a bathroom. And so I was standing there by myself. Other people in the family were looking at different things. And it occurred to me, this is the room where I accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I remember it in vivid detail. And the next thing that flashed into my mind was, I have never told someone that story. I mean, I couldn't even believe it. Why have I never told anybody this story? This is what happened in this room. And for a second, I was tempted to just holler and tell everybody, come here, I got to tell you a story about this room. And I didn't. Maybe I should have. But that kind of compelled me to think, we need to share our stories. We need to tell our stories. And the other thing that happened was, when I've made these other books, the cookbook and the cabin book, I always bring an extra copy up to our cabin. And because that's when people are quiet. That's when people aren't on the internet. That's when people have time to sit and read and sit and talk. And I just kind of leave them there sitting out. And I was up there with two of my nephews. They were from two different families, actually, so they're cousins to each other. And they picked them up. And they started asking me questions. They started asking my brother questions. And they started saying, tell me more about this. Now, why did you do it that way? Or, I never knew that about this. And then they started going into the cookbook. And they started saying, yeah, I actually make recipes. I actually make some of these recipes, do them. And I was like, wow. And it just confirmed to me that there was a yearning, there was a hunger for the stories. And so I decided that I was going to go ahead and do this story, this book on faith stories. I invited everyone from my generation to participate. So I have 7 siblings and 6 in-laws. So with me, that's 14 people. So it was a lot. Okay. And I was really putting it out there for them to write their own stories. And I had a friend of mine say to me, she said, well, what if somebody writes something you don't agree with? And I said, what do you mean if? They're going to. But I can't share my story without welcoming them to tell their story too. And, I'm going to pray and know and believe that the truth will win out, and so on. So I have a question for you. I've kind of told you a little bit about my family, that maybe I was anticipating a little bit of resistance to sharing my Christian faith story. How many of you would say, yes, you're like me? How many of you would feel some resistance from your family to kind of hear stories? Yeah. So you're not sure, Jennifer's not sure. Yeah, I don't know. And I wasn't sure. I was just thinking that it could happen. I sent them a list of questions. I asked them questions about stories, experiences they had. And I tried to make them so they weren't necessarily limited to the way I would answer them. So let me give you some examples. And this is on the handout. You'll see these on the handout. So, did you have a spiritual mentor in your life? Tell a story about him or her. So that's a pretty open question, right? I would say that all of my family would say yes, they had a spiritual mentor, even if they aren't currently walking a Christian faith, walking with the Lord. Tell about a place or a time where you felt especially close to God. So some of the questions were more broad like that. That would be, what everyone would feel like, oh, I can answer that. So, and my point isn't to be compromising. My point is to not, if they read the list of questions, they say, well, clearly this isn't for me. This isn't about me, because these questions are all kind of narrow. So I tried to keep the questions so that they would feel welcome to participate in the project. So here, back to Terry's question. What I said to them, and, I did have quote unquote final approval. I said, this is and this is on the handout, this is a chance for you to tell stories, not to tell us your doctrine. Okay? This is a chance for you to tell about experiences you have. This happened to me. I went here. I did this. I was with someone, and this is what happened between us. And so I made it pretty clear to them in the original invite, and then also as I met with them, which I'll talk about, that this is not about saying what you believe. It's telling your stories, your experiences. What I did was I sent them the questions, and I said, I'm going to be, again, just with the cook, like I did with the other ones. I found I had to really meet with them. And so I would either meet with them and write down, take notes, and then I would pretty soon after write it up myself. And then some people said, no, I want to write it myself. Either way, even if I wrote it, I sent it to them to look at it and see if they wanted to change anything. But again, I met with them one-on-one and, and help prompt them and pick questions. And I told, I'm like, you don't answer. I have 11 questions on my list. Some people did all 11, but most people picked 4 or 5 maybe. I told them it was up to them how many they picked, okay? So I called it taking turns, partly because you think about the turns in your life symbolically, but also taking turns because the way I did it was just, it wasn't like one whole section about Mark. It's like, here's one story about Mark. Here's one story about Nancy. Here, so it's like a conversation. And I made up little chapter headings as the stories came in. I kind of found ways to kind of pull some together, like one about when you felt God really heard you, send me when someone felt called to go. There were a lot of stories that kind of had that theme. So I kind of made up themes. God, when you felt God spoke to you. So here's when somebody felt like God spoke to her through scripture. There were others who talked about times when God spoke to them. But here's just some tips. The way, when I started to include people in the process, that gave them some ownership. So I pointed out some ways to do that along as I was going through the books. Keep the entries short. If they're pages and pages and pages, people are just going to flip to the next picture. So try to keep them short. What I find is that people ask about them anyway, which is also always better to talk about the stories. Find a way to include humor. People love humor. That's just the way God created us. It's this magical thing of humor that makes us feel connected. So include humor. Always include photos. Those intrigue people and compel them to keep working through the book. And one of the things I learned is I knew, and I've learned again, I knew before and I've learned since, is that time, God's timing, and you need to pray about these books. I had a bunch of friends literally sit with their hands on these books around my room and pray over these books, because somebody's going to pick it up right away and read it to cover to cover. Same thing with a DVD. Someone will pop it in right away and watch the whole thing. But some people will file it away and pray that in God's time, when they're ready to hear and God's ready to speak, they'll pull it off the shelf and they'll open it to the page. Just like that morning when Don and the nun met on the beach. There'll be that day when it's the appointed time. And so be praying about that and realize that in time the fruit may come delayed. And so be praying about that. So the last breakout, I'm just going to give you again 4 minutes with your same partner. I think we are going to leave them. Is to just kind of talk with your partner, like what hit you, like, oh, this is what I think I could do at my church. This is what I think I could do with my family. Because as I said, don't feel like you need to do a book like I did a book, whatever. There's different things. This is, you want to start a story circle that meets once a month, or you want to volunteer to tell stories in the service. Tell pastor, I'll interview people and I'll tell a story for the people, or I'll help people prepare to tell their own story or whatever. So whatever it is, just take 4 minutes again to share with your partner what seeds were planted that you might be able to actually put into action in your church or in your family. Okay? Thanks, Roger. You want to do that? Then we'll come back together. I will tell you my email is on the handout, so I welcome any contact through that email. Kind of officially we're done, and my group had great ideas. I hope you heard some great ideas too, and the thing I appreciated was both church and family, both written and spoken, both, you really, I'm glad I didn't get you locked into this book idea, but you had other ideas too. Did anybody have any questions or anything you want to?
I'm having a little question.
Yes.
Handling children, handling the crowd kind of question. What is your tips for handling big crowd or children, especially like?
So your biggest tool to handle a group, whether they're adults or children, is to be really prepared. This is something I learned in grad school. If you don't have a plan, they do. So you want to be engaging, ready, don't have gaps, keep your energy up. If you see people who are fidgety, that would be probably more with children, kind of walk toward them, just really try to keep them connected. That's your best plan. That's your best plan. Because you can't be, it's very hard. If you break out of storytelling to be a disciplinarian, you kind of lost your moment. So yeah, you want to try to draw them in with the story. So Andrew, it's hard for me to really say how long it took because it wasn't like I worked on one thing, but I will do the best I can answer your question. So as I'm a school teacher, so I have the summers off. So usually what I gave these at Christmas. So I would take kind of a year to mull and plant, just real I'm a thinker. And so I just kind of, before I actually do anything, do a lot of mulling. So then the summer before the Christmas I want to give it, I make sure I meet with everybody and interview them, take notes. I get like a special notebook just for that project. And I always have it with me because something might come up on the spur of the moment, take notes. So that I kind of just spread out over the summer. And then when I actually start putting the book together, it probably took somewhere around 15 hours to do the first draft. I'm a kind of a tweak freak, so I go back and tweak the layout and the pictures and all that kind of stuff. So then there's a lot of proofreading and then try to get it to the printer right after Thanksgiving. I have a sister-in-law who has a very strong connection still to her heritage in Ireland, and she has a book that's literally an entire ream of paper. And I'm happy for her and glad that she has it, but I just thought, you know what? I would never read that because it's too long. It's good to have, but I tried to make mine a little bit more manageable.
If in sharing their experiences, if their experience is a negative one, why they don't believe? Is that accepted?
Well, this did come up with a couple people in my family, and I'll just tell you kind of what I did. So I had one brother who, I mean, he is a believer, but he has probably a little different take on some aspects of his faith. And so he said, so all the people who believe this are actually breaking this commandment. And I said to him, I came back to him and I said, I just want you to know there are people in the book who said they believe this. And you are saying they are breaking a commandment by believing that. He says, well, I think they are. And I said, yeah, I realize you think they are. But do you really want me to put that in the book? Is it, you know? And so he kind of tweaked the language a little bit and spoke more from his own point of view. And he said, I realized that I had not really understood this correctly until now, or something like that. I mean, he made it more about himself and not outward to other people. And that's really, I think, as I kind of stumbled into that without even realizing it, that's really the way that's going to help, is to say this is about your experiences, not about what you think of other people. It's not about what you believe even per se. It's about your, you know, this happened. And as a storyteller, I can kind of recognize that. A little trick to use is, if it's a story, you can always start with one time. If it's not a story, you're going to use words like always, everyone, words like that. That means you're making a statement or conclusion. So right. You can always say, if you're not sure if it's a story, you could start one time, I went here and this happened and she did that. And that's kind of your litmus test that it's an actual story. Yeah, I had another brother who kind of wrote a little bit more what I would call theology type things, and I kind of tried to work with them, and you know, he kind of said, well, I don't really remember things that happened. I just know what I believe. You know, and the other thing, my sister was kind of my bouncing, you know, I bounced ideas off her, and when I talked to her, and she said, you know, he's probably said things like that to everybody in person already, you know, so no one's going to be surprised that he thinks that.
Yeah.